They called us backward, primitive, a planet barely out of its adolescence, wobbling into stars like a child walking for the first time. The galactic consensus labeled us a Category 3 civilization, suitable for observation, possibly exploitation, definitely not threat-worthy. That was their first mistake. They saw Earth as a resource pool, raw minerals, atmospheric gases, biological curiosities. What they didn't see were the people. Not soldiers, not tacticians, just people. Teachers, janitors, programmers, nurses. And yet, it was these civilians, cornered, furious, inventive, who would come and dismantle the galaxy's most elite killing force. Contact came in the form of a flash, an orbital incursion above Johannesburg. No demands, no warnings, just energy beams that painted the sky and reduced government buildings to carbon vapor. The consensus called it a stabilizing introduction. Earth's leaders barely had time to understand the term before their communication hubs went dark. In the chaos that followed, armies disintegrated. Chain of command? Gone. Satellite surveillance? Gone. Earth fractured. Cities burned. And in the ruins, civilians scavenged. May was a mechanical engineer in Guangzhou. Before the fall, she designed manufacturing bots. After, she learned how to gut alien scout drones and turn their plasma filaments into defense grids. Jose was a medic from Sao Paulo. He turned broken streetlights into triage lamps and harvested painkillers from the ruins of hospitals. Amina, once a schoolteacher in Cairo, discovered that her steady hands and relentless focus were ideal for long-range shooting. And Carl, retired Navy vet from Detroit, became their mechanic, advisor, and gruff-hearted glue. They weren't chosen. They weren't trained. They simply couldn't run anymore. 2 weeks into the invasion, a galactic patrol attacked a refugee convoy near the Andes. Hundreds died in minutes. Children, families. No strategy, just slaughter. Amina was there. She pulled survivors from the wreckage, half deaf from shock. She found her husband, crumpled near the wheel of their transport, burnt and lifeless. She didn't cry. She just stared. Later, she dug through the rubble and retrieved an intact targeting visor from a dead trooper. That was the first day she stopped being a teacher. Every civilian group acted independently at first. Little pockets of resistance in cities, forests, and caves. They had no fleet, no command, no real weapons. But what they had, what the consensus never anticipated, was imagination. In Nairobi, scavengers discovered that alien sensor drones couldn't register motion through mirrors. They lined alleyways with broken glass and ambushed troops with flame accelerants. In Warsaw, subway workers discovered that the power lines, when rerouted through alien core capacitors, could overload their shields. In Atlanta, kids used VR headsets and cracked alien neural bands to intercept local command signals. Then came the first real victory. May's group had intercepted a troop carrier near Chongqing. It wasn't luck. They had mapped the alien patrol routes based on heat signatures and movement patterns. Carl rigged EMP charges using an old microwave, a car battery, and a salvaged pulse rod. When the carrier floated over a narrow alley, the blast dropped it like a stone. The elites inside scrambled, confused, disoriented. Amina shot the squad leader through its helmet lens. Jose lobbed a makeshift gas canister through the breach. The result was chaos. Afterward, they stood over the smoldering wreck, hearts pounding, breath sharp. Carl cracked open a helmet, pulled free the alien's tactical uplink, and said simply, "We can kill them." Word spread, not through official channels. Those were long dead. But through whispers, hack signals, old ham radios. Civilians took out a drop team. Engineers are hacking weapons. We can fight. But what shocked the consensus wasn't that Earth was resisting. It was how. Their military was built on standardization, efficiency, protocol. Earth's resistance had none of that. Instead, they had unpredictability. Homemade explosives, environmental traps, psychological manipulation. They played music during ambushes, distorted frequencies that disrupted alien comms. They used graffiti to confuse map-scanning drones. They disguised bombs as collapsed structures, left encoded warnings for each other hidden in children's nursery rhymes. None of this made sense to the elites. Their algorithms couldn't account for it. Their troops had no protocol for it. Because Earth wasn't following a plan, it was surviving. And then came the night of the capture helmet. May found it intact after a firefight in a collapsed tower. She and Carl spent 2 days decoding its memory logs. What they found was a gold mine, live comms, enemy troop movements, energy readings, and, most importantly, fear. The log showed spike data from elite heart rates during combat. Fear. Actual fear. The kind the elites weren't supposed to feel. Their commanders were concerned. Their units were faltering. They didn't understand how a bunch of untrained primitives were outmaneuvering professional soldiers. That helmet changed everything. It became a symbol, passed from cell to cell like a holy artifact. Proof that the galaxy's invincible forces bled like anyone else. It lit fire Earth hadn't seen in centuries. Not nationalism. Not vengeance. But defiance. Civilians weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting to remind the galaxy that humanity was not a resource, not a footnote. By the end of the first month, small battles turned into localized offensives. Refugees became tacticians. Artists became cryptographers. Farmers wired bomb collars to old tractors and turned fields into trapped corridors. Every streetlight, every billboard, every school desk became potential weaponry. It wasn't about the tools. It was about the mindset. Adapt, learn, counter, strike. That's how Earth began its war. Not with armies, not with governments, but with broken people who refused to stay broken. People who found strength in grief, purpose in pain, and unity in desperation. And the galaxy? It still thought Earth was a weak, backwater world. That was their second mistake. The tunnels beneath what was once New York City pulsed with quiet energy. Not from alien reactors or military command centers, but from jury-rigged wires snaking through ancient infrastructure. In these underground arteries, civilians had carved out their own war rooms, dimly lit, cluttered with maps, cables, scavenged alien metal, and the hum of possibility. This was where the ship began, not in orbit or on battlefields, but in basements, junkyards, and garages. Here, civilians were not hiding. They were adapting. May hunched over a disassembled alien drone, her gloves coated in iridescent lubricant. Alien systems weren't made to be user-friendly, but they weren't built with sabotage in mind either. She poked at its power node with a soldering rod connected to a 3D printer hacked into a laser cutter. Beside her, Carl was shaping the drone's outer shell into armor plates using an old forge. Every screw, every wire was a victory. Not just reverse engineering tech, but understanding it. Repurposing death into defense. They weren't engineers anymore. They were translators of war. Elsewhere in the tunnels, Jose ran triage drills. He had one functioning med drone, now reprogrammed to carry supplies instead of anesthetics. He used streetlight bulbs as sterilizers, and 4 bags were made from bottled water packs wrapped in duct tape. Every injury treated wasn't just a life saved. It was a weapon preserved for tomorrow. They couldn't afford to lose people. Not when every human life had become more lethal than a plasma rifle. Amina trained recruits using scavenged sniper optics and holographic overlays hacked from alien training helmets. Her sniper range was a subway tunnel stretching 2 miles, lined with mannequins dressed in stolen consensus armor. Recruits didn't shoot to kill. They shot to disable. Optical sensors, knee joints, power lines. You don't need to outgun them, she told them. You just need to outthink them. And that was the heart of Earth's response. Strategy born from necessity, genius from pressure. Consensus forces relied on overwhelming force. Standard formations, predictable tactics. It was all efficient until it wasn't. Earth civilians didn't play by those rules. They planted comms jammers disguised as vending machines. They rigged sewer lids with pressure sensors that triggered flashbang drones. They learned to mimic the footfall of elite troopers to lure drones into traps. Every tactic was a puzzle, every move a mind game. One group in Osaka developed ghost tags, using repurposed alien beacon chips to project false signatures that mimic consensus soldiers. The result? Troopers shot their own units in confusion. In rural Montana, farmers trained pigeons to carry mini EMP payloads. In Reykjavik, a teenager used a school laptop to upload a virus that looped galactic announcements with human music. Imagine a troop of elite soldiers advancing under heavy fire, only to suddenly hear Beethoven's Fifth blaring from their helmets. Morale on Earth surged, not because the war was won, but because it was no longer unwinnable. Carl coined the term weaponized civility. The idea was simple. Take what made humans human, their creativity, stubbornness, emotion, and sharpen it into a blade. They used lullabies as encryption keys. Street graffiti became tactical maps. Grandmothers shared stew recipes that doubled as coded battle plans. A birthday candle could be a detonator, a guitar string, a tripwire. Humanity didn't just adapt. They made war personal. With every salvage weapon, every hacked drone, Earth's people became a new kind of soldier. Not uniformed, not ranked, but effective. They started tracking enemy behavior patterns. May noticed that elite patrols hesitated near cemeteries and began planting fake gravestones around critical entry points. Jose built a neurofeedback rig that let injured fighters ghost pilot drones with their remaining motor functions. Amina developed a noise algorithm that replicated a consensus distress call and used it to draw in enemies for ambush. None of it was sanctioned. None of it was part of any master plan. It was raw survival turned into art. Soon, civilians began coordinating globally, using ancient communication methods, ham radios, shortwave bursts, even Morse code. They shared designs for plasma traps, diagrams for safe dismantling of alien mines, and best practices for turning crashed scout ships into power sources. A family in Nigeria discovered that certain alien alloys reacted explosively with common Earth-based acid. That intel saved hundreds of lives when relayed to South American resistance cells. It was decentralized brilliance, a crowdsourced revolution. Every breakthrough was driven by pain. Every innovation born from necessity. But it forged a resistance the consensus couldn't quantify. When the galactic elites analyzed their battlefield data, they were confused. How had Earth's kill ratios increased by 400% in just 3 weeks? Why were their most sophisticated targeting algorithms failing in urban zones? Why did their troopers show signs of combat fatigue, something they were biologically engineered to resist? They blamed it on environmental stressors, on atmospheric interference, on faulty data inputs. They never considered the truth. Civilians had learned how to fight. May eventually rigged a prototype, a railgun built from subway parts, drone coils, and half a turbine blade. It fired once before overheating, but that one shot took down an armored drop cruiser, a weapon never meant to exist, built by people who weren't supposed to survive. Jose documented every new wound and developed a field manual that fit on a single sheet of paper. His logic? If you can't remember it bleeding out, it's too complicated. Amina's sniper kills reached double digits, not because she loved it, but because she hated it. She tracked her targets by their walking patterns and breathing rhythms, teaching others not to aim for the center mass, but the power conduits and weapon grips. It wasn't about the kill. It was about the disruption. And Carl? He built a tank, a real one, using parts from a demolished monorail, scaffolding, and the engine from a crashed skiff. It was ugly, loud, and slow, but it didn't need to be elegant. It needed to show people that even the impossible could be done with enough stubbornness and bolts. By the end of the second month, the galactic consensus stopped using the word primitive in their dispatches, because Earth civilians weren't just resisting anymore. They were winning. The first sign that Earth had truly changed came not from victory, but from silence. Galactic consensus battalions, once loud and ever-present across occupied zones, began to disappear. Patrols grew sparse. Dropships flew higher, staying out of line of sight. The arrogance that had fueled their initial assault was evaporating. Earth, the unranked backwater, was rewriting the rules of warfare, without any fleet, without any government, and without a single trained army unit. It wasn't a strategic pause. It was fear. The resistance didn't need to push the front lines. They were the front lines. Every neighborhood was a cell, every apartment a command center. Across the globe, civilians had not only adapted alien technology, but surpassed it. Reverse engineering turned into evolution. They weren't just mimicking the enemy's tools. They were improving them. May's engineering hub in Guangzhou now ran on an alien power core stabilized by modified washing machine rotors. With its near-limitless output, she created energy shields that could run on car batteries and pulse weapons disguised as streetlights. They began mass-distributing blueprints in open-source formats, simple enough for a teenager to build with scrap parts, deadly enough to drop an elite in seconds. Carl's tank was now a fleet of improvised landships, each built in junkyards by welders and mechanics who used to fix school buses. They rolled through cities like stubborn metal beasts, not elegant, but impossible to stop. One of them took down a consensus armored mech unit by luring it into a stadium rig with collapsing floors and thermite rain. No military strategist would have approved such a plan, but civilians didn't ask for permission. They just acted. Meanwhile, Jose's field manual had reached over 40 resistance groups across the planet. It was now the de facto survival guide. How to set broken bones using plastic rulers, how to plug plasma wounds with kitchen starch, how to repurpose alien blood clotting foam as anti-shock gel. He wasn't a commander, yet entire squadrons moved only after consulting his notes. Every life he saved came back stronger, sharper, more prepared to kill. And then there was Amina. Her name had become legend among the elites. They never saw her, never heard her, only the silence before the shot and the brief panic that followed. She had moved far beyond the sniper. She was now the architect of ambushes, of misdirection. She trained her team to lay out ghost lanes, corridors where light and shadow created illusions of motion, drawing in troops to chase phantom targets right into kill zones. Her tactics were studied, mimicked, and feared. She was known on enemy comms only as the Invisible. By now, even alien commanders were adjusting. They deployed decoys, sent scouts ahead, launched psychological warfare campaigns with digital broadcasts, offers of surrender, fake news, false rescue signals. But Earth's people had learned the language of deception. They filtered every signal through dozens of verification layers, many of them human intuition, cross-reference radio patterns, or even old-school riddles only locals would understand. It was during this phase that a new resistance strategy emerged: assimilation disruption. Human groups began targeting not just troops, but the very logic of the consensus. They hacked into their supply chains, rerouting food drops into volcanic zones. They hijacked command signals and inserted rogue protocols, causing patrols to receive conflicting orders. Entire cities lit up with false transponder codes, overwhelming the enemy's tracking systems. One teenage hacker in Kolkata created a virus that rewrote the calibration settings on elite helmets, making them perceive friendly fire zones as enemy-free. The first battle where it was deployed resulted in a consensus squad wiping itself out before realizing the glitch. These weren't isolated wins. They were coordinated, precise, and ever-evolving. And while the consensus had machines, humans had stories. Rumors of a resistance child who could track enemy movement through vibrations. Of a group in Brazil who trained jaguars to stalk night patrols. Of fishermen in Norway luring drop ships into the fjords with hack beacons, causing them to crash into icy tombs. These weren't fairy tales. They were warnings, each one grounded in just enough truth to terrify. And something else began to happen. Consensus defectors. Not many, not openly, but enough. A few low-ranking alien engineers surrendered and asked not for mercy, but for insight. They didn't understand how Earth had accomplished the impossible. What drove people without ranks or training to fight harder than genetically conditioned soldiers? Why would a baker in Rome crawl through sewage lines for 10 hours to plant a pulse bomb? Why would a blind man in Lagos guide a fire team through smoke-filled ruins using only echoes? They couldn't grasp it, because the answer wasn't in a protocol. It was in pain, in memory, in refusal. Every civilian who had lost someone didn't just mourn, they acted. And every act, small, improvised, relentless, chipped away at the illusion of consensus superiority. And so Earth evolved again. Teams began mapping psychic triggers, emotional frequencies that affected elite neural stability. Amina's squad weaponized soundscapes. Children laughing, cries for help, lullabies, all warped into confusion grenades that triggered combat hesitation in enemy troops. It worked. Not always, but often enough to shift the tempo. May develop cloaking modules that bent thermal data, not perfectly, but enough to let strike teams move undetected in cold zones. Carl introduced shock troops, unarmed volunteers carrying signal jammers and beacon floods to sow chaos in the middle of enemy formations. They rarely came back, but their sacrifice carved holes in the invincible wall. No central command gave orders. No president, no general. It was trust, built in the dirt, over ham radios and scavenged coffee, through scars and grit. And when the third month came, the consensus launched its largest strike yet. 5 capital carriers descending over 5 continents simultaneously. A coordinated planetary reset. They called it protocol finality. But Earth had changed. In Johannesburg, the skies lit up with flak from civilian towers rigged with railgun arrays. In Moscow, sewers burst open with EMP geysers triggered by public transportation lines. In Lima, dancers at a festival ran into battle wearing jetpack rigs disguised as parade floats, slamming into carrier wings with suicide payloads. And in Detroit, Carl's final tank, a monument of steel, rubber, and vengeance, charged into the underbelly of a landing craft with 200 pounds of destabilized plasma batteries welded to its frame. Earth had stopped reacting. Now, Earth was attacking. They called it the turning point. Not because it was a single battle, but because everything after felt different. Before, civilians fought to survive. Now they fought to win. The galactic consensus hadn't just underestimated Earth. They'd fundamentally misunderstood it. They thought military might was supreme. But humans had turned scrap into strategy, grief into fuel, and chaos into precision. And that terrified the elites. The consensus command structure began to fracture. Reports surfaced of entire squads abandoning posts, of ships failing to respond to distress calls, of orbital stations going dark. Earth's irregular warfare had eroded not just troops but morale. No algorithm could account for the depth of civilian rage. No command hierarchy could predict the ingenuity of a janitor with a power saw and a vendetta. In the underground labs, May finally cracked the frequency layering used in consensus communications. It allowed resistance cells to impersonate command signals. They didn't use it to flee or hide. They used it to order retreats. Entire elite units were recalled from active zones by voices that mimicked their superiors perfectly. Confusion rippled through the enemy like a virus. Carl, now called the Warden by both allies and enemies, led an assault on a resource processing hub in Iceland. It wasn't just a tactical win. It was psychological. They disabled power to several orbital dropships and left them stranded in the upper atmosphere. Footage of alien troopers being airlifted by civilians using ropes and retrofitted cranes spread like wildfire across resistance networks. For the first time, Earth didn't just look defiant. It looked dominant. Jose, nearly blind now from radiation exposure, coordinated medical networks across 3 continents. His triage methods had become legendary. New recruits were told, if you bleed, bleed where Jose can hear it. His voice, broadcast in 10 languages, guided recovery zones and drop points. He wasn't a doctor anymore. He was a symbol of invincibility. And Amina, the ghost in the wires, became more than myth. Using fractured satellite systems and surveillance scraps, she created predictive movement AI that could anticipate troop behavior based on emotion and pattern recognition. It wasn't perfect, but it worked enough to shift battles before they began. She didn't pull triggers anymore. She aimed resistance like a scalpel, cutting out threats before they spread. As the 4th month of occupation began, the Galactic Consensus issued its first official directive of retreat, not because they were losing territory, but because they were losing control. Every tactical advantage they had, air superiority, technological dominance, troop discipline, had been neutralized or turned against them. Earth, they reported, had become unstable, but that wasn't instability. It was freedom. Across every continent, liberated zones emerged not through conquest, but through collapse. The enemy was folding inward. In some cities, civilians took over consensus barracks without firing a shot. Alien captains surrendered, asking only for safe passage off-world. Resistance leaders didn't celebrate. They handed them food, collected intelligence, and dismantled their weapons. No cruelty, no vengeance, just cold efficiency. One by one, cities went dark, then lit up again, not under alien lights, but under human control. Power stations came back online. Water systems flowed again. Libraries reopened. Only now, they also taught sabotage, field surgery, and resistance history. But Earth didn't stop. They chased the consensus into sky. Using scavenged parts and alien drives, civilians assembled crude but functional spacecraft. Junk birds, they were called. Barely space-worthy, patched together with old shuttles, mining rigs, and salvaged hulls. But they worked, and they launched. The first orbital skirmish wasn't coordinated. It was dozens of ships rising at once, each carrying civilians who had never trained for zero-gravity combat, but knew everything about desperation. They didn't fire in formation. They rammed, boarded, overloaded reactors on impact. The consensus never expected it. Suicidal, erratic, unpredictable, but effective. One junk bird even made it to a low-orbit command station and disabled its comms array with a payload of magnetized steel ball bearings. It didn't explode. It just silenced the voice directing the occupation below. By now, Consensus High Command had reclassified Earth, not as a conquered world, but Class X threat environment, equivalent to nuclear instability, viral weapon outbreaks, and black hole proximity. They didn't see Earth as a failed conquest. They saw it as a disease. But that fear didn't end in orbit. When word reached other civilizations in the outer systems, worlds already subdued by the consensus, something sparked. Underground messages began to surface. Resistance symbols appeared in alien cities. Broadcasts of Earth civilians standing atop captured ships spread like a contagion. Earth wasn't just fighting back. It was teaching others how. That's when the consensus understood their mistake. It wasn't Earth's tech. It wasn't even Earth's biology. It was a terrifying idea now seated across the stars. That civilians could outkill soldiers, that minds could outmatch machines, that rage and love and memory were more powerful than any protocol. One by one, the ships left Earth's orbit, not in victory, not in defeat, but in fear. The last consensus transmission intercepted on Earth was short. It read, "Host world unsuitable for control. Withdraw. Reclassify." And then they were gone. Earth didn't cheer. There were no parades, no final speeches. Instead, people emerged from the underground and cleaned up. They buried their dead, repaired their homes, and archived everything. Every blueprint, every tactic, every story, for whoever came next. Because they knew this wasn't the last invasion. But it was the last time anyone would mistake Earth civilians for victims.